Despite his low reading level, however, I could tell that Chris was an incredibly bright kid. He was also very mature. This combination was a godsend in my classroom, where I could always count on Chris to get my sarcastic jokes, and then either humor me by laughing or retort with a playful or clever comment that I appreciated more than he could ever know. One Monday morning, Chris showed up with his mom, Miss Hayes, and told me that he was moving and changing schools the following day. Chris didn't look like he really cared either way, but I sure did. I told Chris, "No, you are not changing schools. I want you here in my classroom every morning, and I want you here on time from now on." His eyes got wide, and he looked at his mom, who looked at me and said that she would see what she could do. Chris didn't come to school the next day, or the day after that. To be honest, there were so many other things on my plate that I couldn't waste a moment wishing or thinking about the fact that he wasn't at school anymore. Thursday morning at 8:25, I opened my door to greet my students, and I was shocked but excited to see Chris and his mom standing there. "He wanted to come back," Miss Hayes said. "He wants you to be his teacher." It was all I could do to keep my cool. So I nodded slowly and then said in as serious a voice as I could muster, "Good. I'm glad I didn't throw away your notebook yet, Chris. But Chris," I said, "I need you here every day on time and with your homework and reading log ready to turn in." Miss Hayes insisted that she would make sure he got the work done and turned in, and I started feeling pretty good about myself. Chris showed up the next day late and without any homework or his reading log. I was torn at this point between celebrating the fact that he had come back and berating him for not meeting my high expectations. I struggled to find incentives that worked for Chris. Basically, anything I could use to tempt him into doing his homework and reading at night. Nothing seemed to work, and as our FCAT countdown came closer, and Chris's test scores and reading level had not grown much at all, I became more and more nervous and wondered daily if maybe he would have been better off at a different school with a different teacher. One day in October, I asked Chris to call his mom to see if he could stay after school to finish a test. Chris finished his test before his mom arrived, so I told him to sit down and begin his homework. He looked at me, a bit confused, but pulled the balled-up paper from his back pocket carefully, unfolded and smoothed it out, and got to work. About an hour later, Miss Hayes arrived to get Chris, who was struggling but remained focused on his homework. She agreed to wait 10 minutes to let him finish, so he could turn in his first homework all year long before going home for the night. I watched as Chris finished the work, and then, almost ceremoniously, placed the wrinkled paper in my inbox before letting a huge grin take over his face. I couldn't help but smile as I realized how big this moment was for Chris, who probably had not turned in many homework assignments in his life, let alone worked so hard on what he turned in. Full of pride for my student, as well as a strong desire to have that feeling again, I made a completely spontaneous decision that would change both of our lives forever. I pulled Miss Hayes into my office and I asked her if it would be okay if I kept Chris after school every afternoon so he could complete his homework under my watchful eye and ask for help if need be. Miss Hayes said, "Of course, as long as it's all right with Chris." When I proposed my idea to Chris, he looked unsure, so I threw out a promise to give him snack every day after school. Maybe even brown sugar granola bars, which I knew were his favorite. The granola bars sealed the deal, and from that day forward, Chris stayed after school to do his homework and eat brown sugar granola bars. Whenever Chris finished his homework before Miss Hayes arrived to pick him up, I would have him read to me as I graded papers or cleaned up my classroom. I loved listening to him read because even though he struggled so much trying to sound out words that he didn't recognize, I could tell that he was reading at a pace that allowed him to actually comprehend the story. Unlike so many of my students, Chris would laugh at the funny parts of a book and take time to stop and look at the pictures on a page before he began reading. Even with my limited experience teaching reading, I could tell that once he figured out how to sound out or decode words and actually took the time to practice, he would take off. By no means, however, were these afternoons like a montage out of Freedom Writers. Getting Chris to do his homework without him constantly getting distracted was like pulling teeth. He was always asking questions, making goofy comments, or just plain being an 11-year-old boy. In the beginning, it took him over an hour to read a short passage and answer 5 multiple-choice questions. As time passed, Chris got better and better at these exercises, and by the time FCAT rolled around, he was completing them in 10 to 15 minutes. One of the passages was about the Olympics and how they have changed since their birth in Greece. Chris, who was working on this passage one afternoon, got up from his desk and came over to me with the text. He pointed at the word Greece and asked me what it was. We broke the word down, blended the parts until he said, Greece. After seeing me nod, he frowned. That doesn't make sense, Miss Feigert, he said. There are only 2 kinds of grease I know. The kind of grease that goes in the pan and the kind of grease that goes in your hair. The FCAT was always looming over the heads of my students, especially Chris. He took the test last year in 3rd grade and scored a 1, the lowest score you can get. The same day I asked Miss Hayes if I could keep Chris in the afternoons, I told Chris that if he comes to school, works hard in class, and stays afterward to do his homework, that he will pass the FCAT. I told him that he will pass the FCAT if he works hard. Chris didn't believe me. Grasping at a way to make him believe me and thus in himself, I said, okay, Chris, here's the deal. When you pass the FCAT, I will take you to the University of Virginia so you can see what college is really like. Chris stared blankly at me. How do you know I'll pass? He asked. I know because you are smart, hardworking, and we are going to work together to make you an amazing reader. I could tell Chris wanted to believe me. Whether or not he truly did at that point remains a mystery. I quickly realized that, especially with Chris, every second counts. For a kid who didn't know that CH makes the ch sound, and who thought that S makes the sh sound, sounding out words was a lot harder than just sounding them out. I concluded that Chris needed 3 things. 1, rigorous phonics instruction. 2, other strategies for figuring out what a word meant. And 3, a whole lot of practice. Unfortunately, for one reason or another, practice didn't seem to be happening at home. Chris never ever made excuses or even gave reasons for why he hadn't been reading more at home. His face would just look upset because he had disappointed me and hopefully himself. To be perfectly honest, however, I was not doing enough work on my end either. My rigorous phonics instruction consisted of Chris reading out loud and me making funny noises with my throat whenever he pronounced a word incorrectly. We would then stop, look at the word, break it down, blend it together, and once in a while discuss the phonics rule. And before we knew it, FCAT was upon us. We waited months for FCAT scores to come back. Students and parents alike kept stopping by, emailing, calling, and texting to see if the results had come in. But Chris didn't talk about the scores very much. He didn't seem nervous about them either. This was probably a good thing because I was nervous enough for Chris, Miss Hayes, and the rest of his family combined. We got the scores back 5 minutes before dismissal one afternoon in the first week of June. I was nervous to look through the list and find my students' scores, so I just paced back and forth in my room, clutching the report to my chest. As one of my students put it, I was out of control and freaking out. And one of my kids even came up, and I'm not kidding, squeezed me for a couple minutes so I would stop shaking. After finally pulling myself together, I opened the report and began to scan for my students' scores.